Good morning, welcome everyone. Huberman Lab. Our brain is a beautifully complex, finely tuned system, yet it's surprisingly vulnerable to what we eat. Today, we're diving into a powerful topic that affects every aspect of our physical and mental performance: the impact of sugar and processed foods on your health. I want to walk you through 5 signs backed by neuroscience, physiology, and psychology that indicate sugar and ultra-processed foods are altering your biology in ways you might not even be aware of. Let's begin. Our ability to focus, regulate emotions, make decisions, and retain information. All of that depends heavily on a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This region is incredibly sensitive to energy availability and specifically to glucose, the primary fuel our brain uses. But here's where things get complicated. It's not just about getting glucose to the brain, it's about how and when it gets there. And that's where sugar, particularly in excess, begins to interfere with the natural function of this highly tuned system. When you consume refined sugar, especially in large amounts or repeatedly throughout the day, what happens is a rapid spike in blood glucose. Your pancreas responds by releasing a surge of insulin to shuttle that glucose into your cells. But this process doesn't just balance energy. It also sets off a series of neurological consequences. When glucose floods the system too fast, the brain gets overstimulated and then experiences a dramatic drop-off as insulin drives the sugar out of the bloodstream. This up and down swing directly impacts the prefrontal cortex. The result: you lose the ability to focus for extended periods. Your attention span shortens. Tasks that require planning or decision making feel more mentally taxing. This isn't just a feeling. It's a reflection of the fact that the very neurons involved in these processes are being deprived of the stable energy they need to fire efficiently. Now, let's talk about BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is a molecule critical for synaptic plasticity, which is the ability of neurons to strengthen or weaken connections based on experience. BDNF supports learning, memory consolidation, and overall cognitive flexibility. Multiple studies have shown that high sugar intake is correlated with reduced levels of BDNF in the brain. That's significant because lower BDNF means fewer new neurons being formed in the hippocampus, less adaptation of brain circuits to new information, and even potential vulnerability to neurodegenerative diseases. This means that over time, a diet consistently high in sugar doesn't just make you feel foggy. It's actually impairing your brain's ability to adapt, grow, and evolve. You're literally making your brain less plastic, less responsive to learning, and more susceptible to degeneration. There's also the matter of neuroinflammation. When sugar and processed foods are consumed in excess, they contribute to low-grade inflammation, not just in the body, but in the brain. This inflammation can interfere with neurotransmitter signaling and reduce synaptic efficiency. It becomes harder to think clearly, to hold attention, or even to control your emotions. The inflammatory signals disrupt the delicate balance of chemicals like dopamine and acetylcholine, both crucial for attention, motivation, and learning. Speaking of dopamine, sugar causes a rapid spike in this reward-related neurotransmitter. But the truth is far more powerful. You feel good, alert. He is not after a distant sugar-high meal or drink. But the brain quickly adapts. Repeated high sugar intake actually leads to a downregulation of dopamine receptors. That means over time, you need more and more sugar to feel the same rewarding effect. Meanwhile, your baseline level of motivation and attention starts to decline. This dopamine desensitization contributes to procrastination, difficulty starting tasks, and a chronic sense of mental fatigue. Now, let's layer in the role of stress. The prefrontal cortex is involved in inhibiting the stress response. But when it's impaired, the amygdala, the part of the brain involved in fear and emotion, becomes more active. So, not only does sugar reduce your focus, it also makes you more emotionally reactive, more impulsive, and more prone to anxiety or frustration. This creates a cycle. Lack of focus leads to frustration, which triggers stress, which further impairs focus. And if your response to that cycle is more sugar, the spiral deepens. To support cognitive function and sustained focus, the goal isn't to eliminate glucose. Your brain needs it. The key is stable blood sugar. This means consuming foods with fiber, healthy fats, and protein that slow down digestion and release glucose gradually. It means avoiding frequent snacking on high sugar foods that push you into those highs and lows that the brain interprets as instability. Understanding this isn't about guilt, it's about gaining control. Knowing how sugar interacts with your biology gives you the power to make choices that serve your long-term cognitive health, because ultimately your ability to think, plan, decide, and grow, those are your most valuable assets. And you can protect them, starting with what you put on your plate. One of the most misunderstood systems in the human body is the dopaminergic system, the circuit in the brain responsible for motivation, drive, and reward. Dopamine isn't just about feeling good. It's about pursuing goals, sustaining effort, and maintaining energy throughout the day. And what's especially important to understand is that the foods you eat, particularly processed foods high in refined sugar and fats, can profoundly affect this system, often in ways that leave you drained, demotivated, and stuck in a cycle of craving more of the very things that are making you worse. When you consume a food high in sugar or processed carbohydrates, think candy, white bread, sugary cereal, soda, your brain gets an immediate signal of pleasure. That's dopamine at work. This fast-acting, high-reward feedback system evolved to help us prioritize calorie-dense foods in times of scarcity. The problem is, in our modern world of constant food abundance, these superstimuli overload the system. Dopamine isn't just released when you eat sugar, it's released in anticipation of sugar. This means the very smell or image of a sugary or processed food triggers a dopamine response, creating what we call dopaminergic prediction. And when the actual experience of eating doesn't match that expectation, or when it ends too quickly, you get a crash, a biochemical disappointment. That crash is where people lose energy, feel sluggish, irritable, or even mildly depressed. This is what makes processed foods especially dangerous. They create an unnatural peak in dopamine, a spike, and then a sharp drop. The brain interprets this drop not as a return to baseline, but as a deficit. That deficit motivates you to seek out another hit. It's not that you love sugar, it's that your brain is now depending on it to feel normal again. This is the core of addiction psychology, and it's the same principle that underlies substance abuse. Now, let's talk about energy. Sugar, as glucose, is a fundamental fuel for the body and brain. But when glucose enters the bloodstream too quickly, insulin is released to clear it just as fast. That rapid entry and exit create an energy roller coaster. Initially, you feel alert and even euphoric after consuming sugar. But 30 to 60 minutes later, you're tired, hungry again, and struggling to concentrate. This isn't a willpower issue, it's a neurochemical rebound. Your cells, particularly your neurons, experience a mismatch between energy supply and demand. They were flooded with fuel, then suddenly deprived. That drop triggers fatigue, brain fog, and a strong desire to eat again, often something sugary or processed, perpetuating the cycle. It gets worse when this happens chronically. Repeated overconsumption of sugar, rich and highly processed foods causes insulin resistance, meaning your cells become less responsive to insulin's signals. That leads to consistently higher blood sugar, more circulating insulin, and eventually metabolic dysfunction. But beyond that, insulin resistance also affects the blood-brain barrier, the filter that protects your brain from harmful substances and regulates nutrient entry. Once that barrier is compromised, neuroinflammation increases, and the ability to regulate appetite, mood, and motivation is significantly impaired. Back to dopamine. When these unnatural peaks happen frequently, the brain tries to protect itself by reducing the number of dopamine receptors. This is called dopamine receptor downregulation. What this means is, the same amount of sugar no longer produces the same pleasure or motivation. So you start consuming more not because it feels better, but because without it, you feel worse. Your baseline levels of motivation begin to decline. You struggle to engage with normal, everyday activities because they don't provide the same intense stimulus. People often report difficulty focusing, a lack of drive, or emotional numbness after months or years of high processed food intake. These aren't just mood issues, they're the result of chronic misfiring in the reward system. The circuits that are meant to motivate you toward growth, learning, connection, and achievement are instead being hijacked by substances that give a quick high but leave your brain underperform. Over time, the good news is that this system can be reset. Dopamine receptors recover with time away from high-sugar, ultra-processed foods. Your energy stabilizes when glucose is delivered slowly, through whole foods rich in fiber, healthy fats, and complex carbohydrates. And your motivation returns as your brain starts to re-engage with real-world sources of dopamine: exercise, meaningful goals, human connection, sleep, and sunlight. So the takeaway here is not to vilify sugar, but to recognize that processed foods hack your reward system in a way that undermines your energy, mood, and drive. The system that was designed to keep you alive and thriving has been turned against you, but you can take it back, one decision at a time. One of the most powerful, yet often overlooked, influences on our mental health is not in the brain itself, but in the gut. The relationship between the gut and the brain is bidirectional, dynamic, and remarkably sensitive to the foods we eat, especially sugar and processed foods. To fully understand how these substances affect our mood, we need to explore the gut-brain axis and the role of inflammation in shaping emotional and psychological states. First, let's establish something crucial. The human gut is home to trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, that collectively make up what we call the gut microbiome. This system is responsible for breaking down food, regulating immune function, and synthesizing important neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. In fact, more than 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut. Serotonin is the key neurotransmitter that stabilizes mood, regulates anxiety, and promotes a sense of well-being. So when your gut microbiome is imbalanced, serotonin production can drop, and your mood drops with it. Now here's where sugar and processed foods come into play. These substances promote the growth of harmful gut bacteria and decrease the diversity of beneficial bacteria. Over time, this imbalance, known as dysbiosis, creates conditions in which the gut lining becomes inflamed and permeable. This is commonly referred to as leaky gut syndrome. When the gut lining loses its integrity, bacteria and toxins that were supposed to stay in the digestive tract start leaking into the bloodstream. The body interprets this as a threat. It activates the immune system, which releases pro-inflammatory cytokines, chemical messengers that promote inflammation throughout the body, including the brain. And this is where we begin to see the connection to mood disorders like anxiety, depression, and emotional dysregulation. These inflammatory molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier, a protective filter meant to shield the brain from harmful substances. Once inside, they alter neurotransmitter signaling and neural connectivity, especially in areas involved in emotion regulation, such as the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. For example, chronic inflammation decreases the availability of serotonin and increases the activity of stress-related pathways. One of the main stress hormones, cortisol, becomes dysregulated. Instead of following a healthy diurnal rhythm, rising in the morning and tapering at night, cortisol levels may stay elevated or crash unpredictably, leading to irritability, mood swings, poor sleep, and even panic attacks. You might be wondering, how fast does this happen? The answer is surprisingly quickly. Studies have shown that even a single high-fat, high-sugar meal can increase inflammatory markers within hours. Repeated over days and weeks, this creates a chronic low-grade inflammation that is strongly associated with both clinical and subclinical mood disorders. Equally important is how sugar affects the vagus nerve, the main communication highway between the gut and the brain. When the gut is inflamed or imbalanced, signaling along the vagus nerve becomes disrupted. This further impairs mood regulation and can lead to a diminished sense of motivation, pleasure, and emotional resilience. There's another layer here worth addressing: the impact of processed food on neuroplasticity. Chronic inflammation reduces BDNF brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels, which are essential for learning, memory, and emotional adaptability. When BDNF is low, people tend to ruminate more, feel stuck in negative thought loops, and have a harder time recovering from emotional setbacks. That's not just psychology, that's impaired brain function, downstream from inflammation rooted in dietary patterns. All of this makes it clear: the connection between food and mood is not just a matter of avoiding a sugar crash. It's about understanding that your gut health is a direct driver of your emotional and psychological well-being. And the standard diet, high in processed sugars and low in fiber, is actively disrupting that system. What can be done? First, begin rebalancing the gut microbiome by eliminating or reducing highly processed foods, including added sugars, refined oils, and artificial sweeteners. Then, focus on increasing intake of fermented foods like yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, and kimchi, which introduce beneficial bacteria. Prebiotic fibers found in foods like garlic, onions, bananas, and oats can also help fuel these microbes. Hydration, sleep, and regular physical activity, especially Zone 2 cardio, also help reduce systemic inflammation and improve gut health. And perhaps most importantly, recognize that feeling anxious, low, or emotionally unstable doesn't always start in the mind. It may be the result of an inflammatory cascade that began with what's on your plate. That's empowering, because it means you're not helpless. You can shift your mood, improve your mental health, and regain clarity by healing the gut and reducing the inflammatory load caused by sugar and processed food. The nervous system is adaptive, and with the right inputs, it will begin to repair, but it starts with awareness and it continues with action. Sleep is one of the most critical levers for human performance, brain health, mood regulation, and longevity. It is the time when the brain repairs itself, when memory consolidates, when the body releases growth hormone, and when the immune system is strengthened. But what many people don't realize is how directly their nutrition, especially sugar and processed food intake, interferes with sleep quality. And I don't mean just how long you sleep. I'm talking about how deeply you sleep, how well your brain restores itself during that time, and how refreshed you feel when you wake up. To understand how sugar affects sleep, we need to begin with blood glucose dynamics. When you consume a meal or snack high in sugar or refined carbohydrates, your blood sugar spikes rapidly. This triggers a sharp insulin response, and blood sugar levels subsequently fall, sometimes very quickly. If this drop occurs while you're asleep or trying to fall asleep, the body experiences it as a stress signal. And that signal is met with the release of counterregulatory hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline. These are the same hormones your body releases in response to a threat, which means they can cause nighttime awakenings, restlessness, racing thoughts, and difficulty falling back asleep. People often wake up between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. and don't understand why. In many cases, this is not due to anxiety or external stressors. It's due to unstable blood glucose caused by late evening consumption of processed, sugar-rich foods. Let's go a level deeper. The human body runs on circadian rhythms, 24-hour biological clocks that govern everything from hormone release to cellular repair to cognitive performance. These rhythms are regulated by external cues, primarily light, but also timing and content of food intake. When you eat processed foods late at night, particularly those high in sugar or artificial additives, you disrupt your natural melatonin in production and phase, shift your internal clock. That's because insulin doesn't just regulate glucose. It also interacts with clock genes in tissues throughout your body. When insulin spikes late in the evening, it sends the wrong time signal to the body, telling it that you're still active and needing fuel. This desynchronizes the communication between your brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus SCN, the master clock, and peripheral clocks in your liver, muscles, and gut. That misalignment leads to fragmented, inefficient sleep. Now let's talk about deep sleep or slow wave sleep. This is the phase when the brain undergoes the most profound recovery. During deep sleep, the brain's glymphatic system flushes out waste products, metabolic byproducts like beta amyloid that accumulate during wakefulness. This process is crucial for long-term brain health and reducing risk of cognitive decline. However, research shows that a diet high in sugar and saturated fats reduces time spent in slow wave sleep. Why? One reason is the effect of sugar and processed food on inflammation. High glycemic, low fiber foods elevate systemic inflammation, which interferes with normal sleep architecture. Inflammation disrupts the balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, particularly GABA, the primary calming neurotransmitter required to initiate and maintain sleep. When GABA signaling is impaired, you may feel wired but tired, that is, physically exhausted but mentally overstimulated. Another layer is the effect of sugar on serotonin, which is the precursor to melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep onset. High sugar intake initially raises serotonin levels, but repeated exposure and insulin spikes cause dysregulation of serotonin pathways over time. This leads to a reduction in natural melatonin production, making it harder to fall asleep and shortening overall sleep duration. And perhaps most troubling is the longer-term impact. Poor sleep due to sugar. Heavy diets feeds back into increased cravings for more sugar and processed foods the next day. Studies have shown that even a single night of poor sleep increases ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and decreases leptin, the satiety hormone. In this state, the brain becomes more reactive to high-calorie, low-nutrient foods. That means poor sleep not only makes you feel tired, it also makes you more likely to reach for the very foods that are disrupting your sleep in the first place. It's a closed loop, and for many people, it becomes a vicious cycle. So, what's the solution? It starts with nutritional timing and quality. Avoiding sugar and processed foods, particularly in the hours leading up to bedtime, can significantly improve sleep depth and continuity. Consuming foods rich in magnesium, tryptophan, and healthy fats earlier in the evening can support serotonin and melatonin in production naturally. Ideally, you want your last meal to be 2-3 hours before bed and composed of whole, nutrient-dense ingredients. Also consider stabilizing your blood sugar across the day by choosing low glycemic carbohydrates, adequate protein, and healthy fats. This prevents the roller coaster effect that carries into your nighttime physiology. And don't overlook hydration, light exposure early in the day, and physical activity, all of which interact with sleep and nutrition at a neurobiological level. Sleep is not just a passive state, it is a powerful foundation for brain function, emotional stability, and physical health. And the quality of your sleep starts not with what you do at night, but with what you eat during the day. Hormones govern everything, from your energy levels and mood to metabolism, fertility, sleep, and even cognitive performance. These chemical messengers operate within finely tuned feedback loops, adjusting in real time to your environment, behavior, and especially what you eat. And one of the most powerful, yet most commonly disrupted, influences on hormonal balance is the chronic consumption of sugar and processed foods. At the center of this conversation is insulin, the hormone responsible for moving glucose from your bloodstream into your cells to be used as energy. Now, insulin is essential for survival. Without it, we can't properly regulate blood sugar. But when you consume excessive amounts of high glycemic, refined foods, like white bread, sweetened beverages, baked goods, and processed snacks, you continuously flood the system with glucose. In response, your pancreas pumps out more and more insulin. Over time, the cells in your body become insulin resistant, meaning they stop responding efficiently to insulin signals. This is where the cascade begins. insulin resistance isn't just about diabetes risk. It's the gateway to a wide array of hormonal imbalances that affect how you feel and function every single day. Let's start with leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that regulate hunger and satiety. Leptin tells your brain you're full, ghrelin signals that you're hungry. When you're insulin resistant, leptin signaling is impaired. Even though there's plenty of energy in the system, the brain doesn't receive that message clearly. So you keep eating. Simultaneously, ghrelin levels stay elevated longer than they should. This creates a feedback loop where hunger persists despite adequate or excessive caloric intake. And this isn't psychological, it's physiological. This disruption of hunger and satiety cues makes it incredibly difficult to regulate food intake. You feel tired and irritable when you don't eat, and unsatisfied even when you do. It's a biochemical environment that favors overeating, cravings, and weight gain, particularly visceral fat around the abdomen. And that type of fat is hormonally active. It releases pro-inflammatory cytokines and further disrupts metabolic balance. Now let's talk about cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. Elevated cortisol is not inherently bad. In fact, healthy cortisol spikes in the morning help you feel alert and focused. But when insulin is chronically elevated due to poor diet, it throws off the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal HPA axis, the central command for your stress response. This can cause cortisol to remain elevated at inappropriate times, particularly at night, disrupting sleep and amplifying anxiety. Worse yet, high cortisol levels promote muscle breakdown and fat storage, particularly in the liver and midsection, while also interfering with thyroid hormones. That means lower energy production, slower metabolism, and reduced thermogenesis, your body's ability to burn calories efficiently. Another major consequence of metabolic dysfunction is its effect on sex hormones, namely testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. In men, insulin resistance has been linked to lower testosterone levels, which correlates with reduced energy, libido, muscle mass, and increased depressive symptoms. In women, excess insulin can stimulate the ovaries to produce more androgens, male hormones, which is one of the underlying mechanisms in polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, a common condition linked to infertility, irregular cycles, acne, and weight gain. Processed foods also increase aromatase activity, an enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen. In men, this can lead to low testosterone and elevated estrogen, producing symptoms like fatigue, mood instability, and fat accumulation in areas like the chest. In women, estrogen dominance relative to progesterone can result in painful cycles, mood swings, and disrupted ovulation. It's important to understand that this isn't about one bad meal or an occasional treat. These imbalances emerge over time through consistent consumption of foods that the body was not designed to process in such quantity and frequency. The body adapts to what you give it. Feed it stability, whole foods, steady energy, fiber, and micronutrients, and it responds with balance. Feed it chaos, sugar spikes, processed oils, additives, and the system begins to misfire. What's powerful is that many of these changes are reversible. Hormonal pathways are dynamic, and they respond to consistent behavioral inputs. When you reduce sugar intake and replace processed foods with whole, nutrient-dense options, vegetables, lean proteins, healthy fats, and slowed digesting carbohydrates, you stabilize insulin. And when insulin stabilizes, hunger hormones normalize, cortisol rhythms realign, sex hormones rebalance, and metabolism improves. Sleep gets better, mood improves, energy becomes more stable, and your body becomes more resilient to stress, both physical and psychological. It's not just about avoiding disease. It's about optimizing your internal environment to support focus, vitality, emotional balance, and longevity. Hormones don't work in isolation. They are part of a highly integrated system, one that responds intelligently to the signals you send it every single day. And food is one of the loudest signals of all. When we talk about brain health, we often focus on things like memory, focus, mood, or maybe prevention of diseases like Alzheimer's. But what many people don't realize is that long-term brain function is deeply influenced by everyday nutritional choices, especially the regular consumption of sugar and ultra-processed foods. These foods do more than just affect your waistline or short-term energy. They fundamentally alter the biology of the brain over time. Let's start with the brain's structural and functional plasticity, its ability to adapt, grow, and change in response to experience. This plasticity is powered by molecules like BDNF brain, derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth of new neurons and synaptic connections. High levels of BDNF are associated with learning, creativity, emotional resilience, and mental clarity. But frequent consumption of processed foods has been shown to lower BDNF levels, effectively making the brain less adaptable and more rigid. That rigidity doesn't just make learning harder. It increases vulnerability to cognitive decline and mental illness. One of the reasons processed foods are so harmful to brain plasticity is because of the inflammatory load they place on the body. These foods, high in refined sugars, industrial seed oils, artificial additives, and lacking in fiber, trigger systemic inflammation. And when inflammation becomes chronic, it doesn't stay confined to the body, it travels to the brain. The brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier, a semipermeable membrane designed to keep toxins out. But chronic inflammation weakens this barrier, allowing harmful molecules and immune cells to enter and disrupt neuronal function. Inside the brain, this inflammatory activity particularly targets areas responsible for memory and cognition, like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. Over time, inflammation interferes with synaptic signaling, mitochondrial energy production, and even gene expression. The result: and without fanfare, poor memory retention, learning, RISK for GRIND, ING, without disordering, LIKE, pendition, anxiety, ST neurode, Jenner, save us this why their diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Let's also talk about oxidative stress, another mechanism through which processed foods accelerate brain aging. Oxidative stress occurs when there's an imbalance between free radicals, unstable molecules produced during normal metabolism, and antioxidants, which neutralize them. Processed foods not only generate more free radicals due to poor nutrient quality, but they also deprive your system of the antioxidants required to neutralize them. Over time, this imbalance leads to cellular damage in neurons, impaired DNA repair, and faster cognitive aging. Now consider the brain's reliance on mitochondria, the energy factories of your cells. Neurons are especially energy demanding, and their ability to function depends on stable, efficient mitochondrial output. Diets high in processed foods impair mitochondrial function, leading to brain energy deficits. That's not a metaphor. You'll feel it as brain fog, delayed thinking, lack of motivation, and difficulty processing information. Another, underappreciated impact of processed diets is on the gut-brain axis. We now know that the gut microbiome directly influences neurotransmitter production, immune system activation, and inflammation regulation. A healthy microbiome helps maintain the integrity of the gut lining, supports serotonin and dopamine production, and communicates effectively with the central nervous system via the vagus nerve. Processed foods, however, disturb this microbial ecosystem, reducing beneficial bacteria, encouraging the growth of harmful strains, and increasing the permeability of the gut wall. This leads to a situation often referred to as neuroinflammation, an inflammatory state of the brain, usually low grade but persistent. Neuroinflammation alters how neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA behave, increasing excitotoxicity, overactivation of neurons, which is a well-known contributor to neuronal death and cognitive decline. It's worth noting that these negative effects don't require years to accumulate. Even in young people, High-processed diets can lead to noticeable changes in mood, memory, and cognition within weeks. MRI studies show that individuals with high sugar and processed food intake often exhibit reduced volume in the hippocampus, even when controlling for other lifestyle factors. That's a measurable reduction in the part of the brain responsible for memory and learning, just from what's on your plate. However, there's good news. The brain is remarkably plastic and repairable, especially when given the right inputs. Reducing sugar and processed food consumption can rapidly lower inflammation, restore healthy gut microbiota, and improve mitochondrial function. Reintroducing whole, nutrient-dense foods, rich in omega-3s, antioxidants, fiber, and micronutrients, helps rebuild the structural integrity of brain cells, supports neurogenesis, and increases BDNF. Physical exercise, especially aerobic training, combined with a low-inflammatory diet, amplifies these benefits even further. Sleep quality improves, focus sharpens, and memory retention increases, not just because of better rest, but because your brain is functioning in a more stable biochemical environment. In short, the food you eat today becomes the structure and function of your brain tomorrow. Processed foods shortcut pleasure at the cost of long-term performance. But when you eat to nourish your brain, you're not just avoiding disease, you're actively shaping your cognitive future. This is an area where knowledge becomes power, and power becomes resilience.